right, so hi everyone, it's Nina Collins. I'm super glad to be here today with my friend Bruce Feiler. Bruce is a best-selling author. He's written 6 consecutive New York Times bestsellers, including The Secrets of Happy Families, Walking the Bible, and The Council of Dads, which has just become an NBC drama series, right? Which just launched, I think, in the last month or so. He's done 2 primetime series on PBS, TED Talks. He's a very prolific writer, and also I'm very pleased to say that he's a friend of mine from Brooklyn Heights. Our kids have gone to the same school. We've known each other for, I think, about 10 years now. And I actually was interviewed for Bruce's book. So welcome, Bruce. Very glad to have you.
Thank you very much. Is this a milestone in Wolfer land here that...
You are the second man to ever be interviewed, but the first to do like Wolfer TV. We had a man. We've been doing this Unlearning Racism series, and we had an expert named David Camp come on last week to talk to us about difficult conversations. But yeah, you have to be really special as a man.
I put on the blue shirt. I put on the blue shirt for you, right? You and I actually think that we've known each other for almost 20 years. I think if we're gonna, I certainly. But
I'm a while. It's right around my divorce, my big divorce, as I call it. So we're here to talk about Bruce's new book, which is called Life in the Transitions, Mastering Change in a Nonlinear Age. And the irony, or the great moment here for someone in book publishing, is that Bruce started to write this book 5 or 6 years ago, not anticipating, of course, that it would be published right now in the middle of enormous transition and upheaval. And I'm going to let him talk in a sec, but I love this book because basically the idea is, the way I read it and think about this book is, the idea is that we're constantly experiencing upheaval and change and big transition. And I think it's something we don't talk about very much or expect in our lives. And in fact, it's really a part of everyday life that we should kind of be preparing our kids for and be acknowledging. And so in this book, he interviewed, Bruce, you can tell us, but I think you interviewed, I don't know, hundreds of people, 6,000 pages of transcripts. He went all over the country interviewing people about what he calls life quakes, so big moments of upheaval. And he looks at how we deal with this and how we get through it. And in the book really helps people understand how they can best handle transition. So tell us about your book a little, Bruce.
First of all, it's great to be with you, and I so admire this community that you have built. And I think that, one way of thinking about what you guys have been building for a few years now is that it's a way, of course, for people to come together and talk about kind of the various transitions that people are going through. And there really hasn't been a lot of language about this. So just to sort of kind of take a step back and set the table here. Yes, I write about life quakes, and life quakes are these kind of big, massive changes that are sort of higher on the Richter scale of consequences and have aftershocks that last for years. And I got interested in this because I went through a life quake. I was just walloped by life. First, I got cancer now 12 years ago. That was around the time of the recession, and my family was hit very hard by this. And my dad, who has Parkinson's, tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. We got these calls from my mother that your father's trying to kill himself. And we were dealing with medical matters and business matters, but I'm the story guy, right? I'm the meaning guy. So I started kind of on a whim every Monday morning sending my dad a question about his life.
I loved this.
Yeah, this was incredibly powerful. Like, tell me about the house you grew up with. How'd you become an Eagle Scout? How'd you join the Navy? How'd you meet mom?
And you were trying to get him to kind of get out of his depression a little. Was that the idea?
Well, I didn't. I later learned that there's a whole field of narrative gerontology, and then you and I had a series of conversations, now that I'm remembering, about narrative medicine and narrative adolescence. So I didn't know all of this at the time, right? At the time, it was sort of like, yeah, give him something to think about other than how he has nothing to live for. Like, let's record his life. And it was a powerful transformation. And what really happened, actually, was that another mutual friend of ours who lives on the other side of where I live here in Brooklyn, he and I were driving up to our 30th college reunion. And I thought we'd catch up. And my friend was closing a huge real estate deal.
I know who this friend is. Okay, go on.
And yet also crying at the same time, because one of his partners had a 9-month-old, and the 9-month-old had gone down for a nap the previous day and never woke up. And so I get to my reunion. I'm actually moderating a panel of prominent classmates, and there are 250 people in the room, and I have their resumes because that's what you give. And I like rip them up. And I said, you know what? Losers don't come to their college reunion. I want you to tell me not about your successes. Tell your mom. Tell me about your struggles. Like, what keeps you awake at night? And this is, again, exactly where, you know, at the time, Wolfer now, but at the time where what would you tell us what really is keeping you up at night that you can't talk about?
That's right.
We had one of these huge reunion tents, as you do. And it took me 2 hours that night to walk from the bar on one end to the barbecue on the other, because people just came rushing up to me. My wife had a headache and went to the hospital and died. My daughter tried to kill herself. My boss is a crook. I'm being sued for malpractice. My brother has stage 4 cancer. And what everybody was saying in one way or another is like, the life I'm living is not the life I expected. Like, I'm living life out of order in some way. Like, that's what I remember thinking. And I called my wife, Linda, who you know, who's a member of your group, and said, I'm sitting on the biggest story. No one knows how to tell their life story anymore. Like, that was all I knew. And I got to figure out how to help. And so that was the impetus for what became this massive project of crisscrossing the country, collecting hundreds of life stories. It was 225, as you said, 1,000 hours of interviews, 6,000 pages of transcripts.
And you had a whole team of interns helping you, trying to make sense of this kind of quality.
And I was, you know, people who lost homes, lost limbs, got sober, got out of bad marriages, were in cults, a 2-time cancer survivor who climbed Mount Everest, like people who lost limbs in Iraq. I mean, it was incredible. And I had 6,000 pages of transcripts, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with this? And so I got a whole team of people. And we sat here for a year and like debated it and like, what is this message sending us? And sort of the big idea that emerged from all of this is like that the linear life is dead.
Mm-hmm.
That you and I were told growing up, which is that we're going to have one job, one home, one relationship, one sexuality, one spirituality. We could talk about this all day, but we were told this for the whole 20th century. Everything happens in stages and order. Passages was the iconic book about this in the 70s, sold 20 million copies. And it literally says everyone does the same thing in their 20s and in their 30s, and everyone has a midlife crisis at 39 and a half. I mean, like, it was so prescriptive. It said it must start at 39 and a half and will end by 45.
Right.
We're in a pandemic now. Like, if you're between 39 and a half and 45, you're having this midlife crisis. But if you're 27 and a half, you're having it. And if you're 67 and a half, you're having it. It was such a reductive. So the linear life is dead. It's been replaced by the nonlinear life, as I call it. And the nonlinear life involves ups and downs and twists and turns. And each of them involves a life transition. And so sort of the big idea that emerges here is that, you know, we go through 3 to 5 times in our lives a big life quake. The transitions that come out of it take 3, 4, 5 years. That's half of our adult lives.
Is spent managing transition.
And my book unveils the first new model for how to navigate transitions in 50 years.
Amazing. So I have so many questions. So what is the first rule about navigating a transition? I mean, I have questions that I didn't know reading the book, but I'm going to ask you some so that our listeners can understand a little bit what happens in the book. So
what I would say is the following. I would say that the life quake that we're talking about, so we have, just again, to quickly set the stage of the kind of the language that I use, we have these disruptors that we go through 36 times. Could be a move, could be an accident, could be, you know, you break your ankle, it could be getting married. Most of these we get through with relative ease.
Right. They're good at that. Right. And they're good transitions. We graduate from college.
Right. And so 1 in 10 of them becomes a life quake. And they're also good life quakes. So life quakes can be voluntary, right? You start a new venture, you get out of a bad marriage, you change religions, whatever it might be. But some are involuntary, right? Yeah. Your spouse cheats on you, you get fired, a pandemic. Yeah. The first rule, I would say, is that the life quake can be voluntary or involuntary, but the life transition must be voluntary. Like, you have to lean in.
You have to lean in.
And choose to take the steps and go through the process that will turn this period of chaos and, you know, sluggishness into growth and renewal. So that's I'd say the first decision. And once you get in, there turn out to be a kind of a structure. When people go into life transitions, I've been thinking about this a lot. Like, they either feel manic and out of control, like I have to do 50 things at once, or you feel like I'm in a fetal position and I can't move and no one's ever been in this position.
Well,
And
yeah, I was about to say, you talk about three transitions, three phases of
yeah,
this, right? The long goodbye, the messy middle, and the new beginning. And I think it's really interesting because you talk about people having a transition superpower. So people are particularly good at one of those. Like I realize I'm particularly good at the new beginning, right? I'm someone who kind of starts things over a lot. The
yes.
long goodbye is hard. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So you look at enough of these, they have a structure. So they have these phases, the long goodbye, where you say goodbye to the old you and kind of have to mourn it and mark it and move on from it. The messy middle, where you shed certain habits and you begin new ones. And then there's this new beginning where you unveil your new self. And it turns, like we were told for the last 100 years of transitions that you must do these in order. Like you first must say goodbye. And then this turns out to be completely misleading, because it does turn out that we're good at certain things. Like a lot of people are not good at saying goodbye. Right? They're people pleasers, or they stay around a toxic relationship, or a job is not fulfilling, or they don't want to disappoint people, and they stay around too long. Some people, it turns out, you're very good, as you said to me in our conversation. And as I quoted you, was it the Wall Street Journal I quoted you in, or the New York Times?
Yes.
You said, like, maybe it's because I lost my mother when I was 19, but I underattached to things. Okay, you're very good at moving on. I used to call the mess, here's a great story. I used to call this the messy middle, the muddled middle. And I interviewed a woman named Rosemary Danielle, who has also had multiple marriages. Her mother, a lot of mental illness and abuse in her life. She's now 80. She's a poet in Georgia, totally saved by writing, and just a wonderful, big-hearted woman. I've known her for many years. And I said, tell me about the muddled middle. And her first two marriages, she left, but her third husband left her, and he was a New York playwright, and she's in Georgia. And she's like, I had enough of these like artsy men. So she went on a binge. She dated only cops, and she lived on an oil rig and slept her way around. She wrote a memoir called Sleeping with Soldiers. And she said, are you kidding, darling? Like, that wasn't the muddled middle. I loved it. So the muddled middle to the messy middle, because some people are very good at that phase. And some people, you would think everybody would like the new beginning, like unveiling the new self, but it's hard. I interviewed a woman named Lisa Ludovici. Oh my God, your readers would love, your kind of members would love this story. So she grew up in a broken home. Her mother had wanted no part of her. She didn't even come to her college graduation. She was homeless for a while. She became a high-powered internet ad executive. And she had 3 migraines a week from when she was 3. And after 20 years earning big bucks, and by now in New York, she logged on early to a conference call, heard her colleagues talk about how sour she was. She walked home, combed through her Amex bills, walked in the next day, and quit on the spot. And she said, I can live for 18 months, but I need to change my life. And she cuts her cable, like stops going shopping, going out to eat. She's watching like, whatever, like local access TV and she sees someone like on day 7 who is a life coach. And she says, I have to do this. She enrolls in life coach school. She goes to Santa Fe. Day 3, her head's on the counter and the teacher says, well, what's going on? She says, oh, I just have a migraine. I've had 3 a week for 40 years. She said, come with me. Takes her back into the office, hypnotizes her. She's never had another migraine. And today she is the country's leading medical hypnotist, working with veterans and people. And she said to me, years into this, she still hadn't updated her LinkedIn profile. She would write it and rewrite it. And she was embarrassed. She thought, people gonna think it's weird. She didn't want, the new beginning was hard for her. And it wasn't until she pressed go that she finally released all that anxiety and she accepted this transition is over and this is her new self, and she can now fully embrace that.
Wow. So one of my questions is, the idea of leaning into a transition requires, I would think, a lot of resilience. What are your thoughts about resilience? Like, do people naturally have it? Is it learned? Can it be taught? What's the value of it?
So my answer is I'm grumpy about the word resilience, okay? So a lot of what I am pushing back on is the idea that life is linear. And in the ancient world, they thought life was a cycle. They didn't even have linear time. In the Middle Ages, and this is so good for this group, in the Middle Ages, they thought life peaked at middle age and then dropped. We grew up thinking middle age was the bottom. So like there's no new love at 50, right? There's no starting a new venture at 60, like it's over. And we grew up in those of us who grew up in the 20th century, which I suppose is many people in this community, were told life is linear. But that linear model was built around the Industrial Revolution. Actually, it was because even Erickson, who said the 8 stages of development, said he modeled it on the conveyor belt. So resilience is actually a physics term of what happens to a spring. You pull the spring out and it bounces back. So the problem that I have with resilience is you might bounce back, but chances are you're going to bounce sideways or forward or a different direction entirely. So I think that the resilience model, like what it's trying to capture is how you get through difficult times. But I think that the actual language falls into this linear trap that I'm trying to get people to avoid and realize that their lives can take all different shapes. And
that the way you respond to hard times takes a million different shapes. So there is no
million different shapes. And so you're not going to, some people go back, but that's really rarely what happens. Part of like the reason there's a long goodbye is accepting that you're not going back. And here we are in the pandemic. Like the first 6 months, we were like, when are we going to go back? I think it's only now, 6 months in,
that we're starting to
realize we're not going back. Like things are going to change. There can be growth, there can be change, there can be, development and renewal, but going back is not really an option. So that's my problem with resilience. But the core idea here, I would say, in terms of what did I learn, is that you can learn the skills, right? So that we know with habits, how many books about habits, right? We know you can break it down and improve. Happiness, right? The whole positive psychology movement. We know you can break it down. There are things that you can do. Okay. I mentioned before we got on the conversation here, I was on CNBC. I was saying to the executives on CNBC, like, you study leadership, but you study communication, but we don't study transitions. And so I think the big thing I learned is that there is a toolkit, there is a roadmap. Your path will be different from my path, but there actually are things you can do to make it go more effectively.
So what are some of those things?
So let's look the long goodbye. Let's talk about the emotions.
Yeah.
225 people. What's the biggest emotion you struggled with in your time of change? Number one, I can't remember. I should have looked your answer up because I have a database.
I would have to be fear. I mean,
number one answer was fear, right? So can I get through it? Can I pay the bills? Am I going to be lonely? Am I going to be happy? Right? Am I ever going to?
I always tell people who are getting divorced, I remember thinking, it's so funny for me to think back on it. When I was 37 years old and was getting divorced, I was so afraid and thought that, like, I was sure I'd be alone for the rest of my life, that I would be like this kind of labeled like divorcee. I don't know. I had this like incredible, and it's ridiculous now to think back at 37 that I felt these things, like my life was over.
So fear is the number one. That's by far 27% was most popular. Then sadness. I like the old life, or I like being with that person, or I liked having the money that job gave me. And then the third is what surprised me. It was shame.
That does not surprise me.
Like I'm ashamed that I'm going through this difficult time. I'm ashamed that I lost my job. I'm ashamed that my child has an addiction. And, when I walk in the supermarket, people turn around and walk away. So how do people deal with that? Okay, so the first is to sort of identify. If you're struggling now, my first advice would be, my first advice is decide to make the transition. Then when you're in it, I would say, ask yourself, what is the biggest emotion you're struggling with? Now that you've put it on the table, what do you do with it? Some people write it down. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Some people do kind of what I would do, which is buckle down and, go to work, right? But 80% of people used rituals of some kind to kind of tame. So they have a farewell party. They hold a ceremony. They bury part of the old past in the backyard. They get a tattoo. I talked to a woman, Lisa Ray Rosenberg, had a really difficult year. She was a bone marrow donor to her brother, had a big blow up and became estranged from her mother, went on 52 first dates. She actually made a spreadsheet so that she remembered what she wore on every first date so she didn't wear it on the second date if she was lucky enough to get a second date. And she said, this is not working. So she said, what's my biggest fear? Jumping out of an airplane. So she jumped out of an airplane. A year later, she was married with a child. So it is a
ritual to start a new.
Exactly. It's a way of saying, like, the past is past.
Yeah.
And to myself and to others, like, I'm moving on to then what's the next phase, which is the messy middle.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I would never think to do a ritual, but that's really interesting that 80% do. That's fascinating.
And so then when we get to the missile, so like, let's keep going with the tip. Then I would say, identify some habit of yours that you don't like, because people shed things.
Yeah.
Okay. It might be a mindset. It might be something that they liked, like they shed an attachment to money, or they shed a routine where sleeping with somebody and now they're sleeping alone. I talked to a woman named Lee Wintz who had cancer, left a big nonprofit job and decided it was a sort of a ho-hum marriage, left her marriage. And she said the number one thing she had to shed in her transition was the habit that every time she came home from work, she would open the fridge and take something out. So she said, I'm finally going to, and she lost 60 pounds and she's managed to keep it. So something about some aspect you shed, because then that opens you up for one of the most thrilling parts, which is people turn to creativity, like astonishing acts of creativity. They sing, dance, paint. I talked to a woman who had also had cancer, stepped down from being a chemistry professor in Alabama. She always left her marriage also, always wanted to be a ballerina. She took adult ballet. I talked to someone who was a conservative writer at Fox News, left Fox News, denounced her conservative views, went through a depression, taught herself ukulele to get through it. So people, what happened in the pandemic? What's almost like the pandemic cliche?
Cooking,
baking,
banana bread, baking, exactly.
baking, right? Like we sourdough'd our way through COVID-19. And that was using your hands to because creativity is an act of imagination. And if you can imagine something small, you can begin to imagine yourself getting to a better place.
Yeah, you can imagine the next place. That's super interesting, the use of creativity. So did you notice in your book a difference in all your research, a difference between men and women?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I would say the short answer is no. But even more, I would say the number one thing that I got wrong was I thought at the outset, as someone who went through cancer, we're talking about suicide in my family, financial troubles, I would have thought that the kind of the toolkit for cancer was different than the toolkit for divorce, was different for the toolkit for menopause, is different for the toolkit from having a child with special needs. Or drinking. A quarter of my stories had addiction of some kind, which was shocking to me. But I was just flat wrong. It turned out that the toolkit for getting through it is more similar. So I would say not only was it not gendered, I would say that it was also not different depending on the nature of the transition that you're going through.
That's super interesting. And your point about shame really doesn't surprise me. Like I think a big part of the reason we started this community and the kind of our raison d'etre in a way is to kind of help women not feel shame about getting older and feeling irrelevant or going through a lot of transition. I've always been very personally interested in transitions of loss. So the idea of like looking at that and acknowledging it and then plowing ahead is really important to me.
By the way, in fact, there's a line, I'm not sure it made it into the final version of Life is in the Transitions, that actually shame was also ungendered. Like the literature on shame suggests that it's kind of, it skews female.
Yeah, it does.
It means that men also feel shame, but they're almost like ashamed to say it.
They're ashamed to say it. Yeah. It's really interesting to me that it's not gendered. I like that. I like the idea that this book that it's really for everyone and that we're all kind of experiencing these things the same way and not the same, right? It's not linear, but we're all having them. We're all having these life quakes over and over again.
I would say it's interesting because now that this book has been out a week, and made the top 20 of Amazon and sort of has clearly touched some sort of nerve, I would say that one of the interesting, surprising things for me is that people are clearly buying it for their own transition. But actually, almost like a greater audience is people buying it because someone that they love is going through a transition and they want something to help them with. Like they want something to do or say to the loved one that's going through it. So it turns out the co-pilots kind of have a taste for it.
That was my feeling reading it. I really felt like I wanted my kids to read it. Like I don't know if it's good view in the sea there, Life in the Transitions. Because I really feel like this is an incredible lesson that kids need to absorb and that people would be a lot better off. It's kind of the idea that, we all expect to have romantic breakups, for example, but we don't talk enough about friendship breakups, which is a real thing that happens over and over in our lives. And it's normal and you don't have to feel ashamed of it. You have to figure out how to deal with it.
Well, I think an interesting thing for you guys to discuss in your community would be a couple things I'll just throw out. First of all, I found that this idea of nonlinearity, that we go through change, that Xers get it you know, they understand it more intuitively than boomers, and millennials even more than Xers. So people are, I think that the boomer generation, we are still haunted by what I call the ghost of linearity.
How old are you again, Bruce? You're like 57.
I was born in 1964, so I'm actually nominally the last year of the baby boom.
Okay.
But my kids are teenagers, right? So your kids are in their 20s, and one of the things that I would love to kind of follow up on, I'm curious if this will trigger a conversation in the ways you guys have these conversations, is there was what I kind of call a transition gap that a lot of parents in their 60s, say, who have children in their 20s, late 20s and 30s, are just baffled and confused. Like, wait a minute, you're having the child before you get married, or like you're buying the house before you have the job, or you're quitting a job and moving to another city and not knowing what you're going to do. Like the millennials are much more comfortable with this kind of nonlinearity. In fact, my research shows that 53% of life quakes are involuntary and 47% were voluntary. And I looked at those numbers and thought, wow, 47% are voluntary. That's impressive. Like, you know, people really are embracing change. The millennial coders that I had were like, whoa, 53% of life quakes are involuntary. Like, they were intimidated. Like, I'm thinking I can plan my life. So,
well, that's that's youth talking.
Yes, exactly right. So they still have we're haunted by the ghost of linearity. Like, they are enamored of the fantasy of control over their lives.
Of course, who wouldn't be? At our advanced age, we know that's not true. Very, very interesting. Well, Bruce, I'm just so glad to talk to you, and I'm excited for you. I'm sure it's going to be a huge bestseller. You're publishing it at the perfect time. And I really think it's very, very useful, and I will make my kids read it for sure.
Well,
have there been any big surprises since it's been published? I'm sure you're just really busy talking all over the place. And
well, I think that I would say the number one this thing is I was on Good Morning America, I was on Today, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. I mean, it's really, it's caught something. And I think that that's been very powerful. I would say if I look at the emails and the kind of the tweets that people are writing to me, one thing that jumps out at me is, I mentioned at the beginning of this that I had cancer, financial problems, and a family emergency. And one of the surprises when I was having the conversations was that these kind of life quakes that I was talking to people about, they tend to clump, right? You know, just when you lose your job, like, you wreck the car. Just when you're going to move to the suburbs, your daughter, turns out to have an anxiety disorder, and grandma needs to have cataract surgery. So there's something about, and I'm like, how do I capture this? I ultimately end up calling it a pileup, because like the old black and white movies where the first car goes and then boom, 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 like there's like this seems to be something that people are writing. I think a lot of people are going through pileups right now. They feel,
I mean, with the economy and health and politics, like the whole world feels like it's going through a pileup.
Right. So this is, I think, there's a language and a conversation around this that I think that we're also not having. And the sort of the traditional, like, oh, you can, 5 minutes of meditation or, some resilient mindfulness. People feel kind of walloped by life, and they kind of feel like they're lonely. I mean, the number one thing that I say to people, that I would like to say to anybody here, you're not alone. Like, we're all going through this. I mean, one of the interesting things that happened when I had these conversations was, let's just say I didn't know you and I was introduced and said, oh, you should talk to Nina. She went through divorce. And I would go into it thinking it was a story of divorce, or a story of a job change, or a story of whatever, anorexia turned recovery. And invariably there would be an interesting, and in some cases more interesting, part of the story that I didn't know. And so the people have these kind of hidden parts of them.
Yeah, hidden stories. I mean, that's certainly something I've learned running the community, right? You scratch the surface and there's so much going on in every.
So that turned out to be an advantage of doing a full life story.
Yeah. Right.
Which is why at the back of this book, I have the questions that I asked you and everybody else so people can do it themselves. By the time we got to some divorce, we'd already talked about your loss of your mom and you're moving back from Europe to take care of your younger brother. And so that you were able to make a connection between this earlier period of your life and this idea of under attachment. And you talked to this about
Yeah.
You're a therapist. So there's something about opening up the full story of our lives that makes us make connections.
Yeah, and I think it also gives us confidence that we can deal with the next one. I mean, it's certainly, that's also something that happens as you get older, right? You develop more wisdom. You kind of know. I feel now when bad things happen, I have a much better sense that I can get through them. But being able to look at everything in your life and the way you've handled things, and your book is talking about really identifying the patterns and the way you handle it, you in particular handle it, and helping you
That's
figure
right.
out.
We all turn out to have a kind of blueprint for which phase we're good at. We have a phenotype. This was another interesting discovery of friendship, right? We talk a lot about friendship, but we all need friends going through this. But it turns out that people respond to different kinds of friendship. Like some people like comforters, like, I love you, Nina. I
Oh, that's
believe in you. You'll get through it. Some people like what have called in this book nudgers. Like, I love you, Nina, but maybe you should try this. And like, maybe you should go to AA, or maybe you should start dating again, all right? Or maybe you should like exercise. And then some people, I'm a bit like this, some people like slappers. Like, I love you, Nina, but get over yourself. Really?
right.
I'm tired of listening to you whine. Get off the sofa and like go take care of it and stop bothering me.
That's interesting. I definitely don't need comforters. I'm one of the other two, but I'll have to think about that a little more. Huh.
Right. So this was an example. I'd have to look at what number you were of the 225.
Yeah.
About halfway through, I was having a conversation with someone, and they were saying, and this woman, it was a woman, Helen, and she was telling me this story about how she was just like, in her own stuff, and her friend like slapped her like Cher slapping Nicolas Cage in Moonstruck,
Right.
which
Yeah.
is where the term slapper. And so I learned this from the interviews, and then I started asking everybody to know kind of which model. And there's also another type of advice, which is modelers, like particular people who might have grown up LGBTQ in an area where that, or a family where that wasn't welcome, or the transgender people in particular who might not have known somebody. They look to almost like public figures to inspire them. So their comfort comes from celebrities or from high profile people who offer them a role. They're kind of role models, but they're not necessarily friends. So this is an example of everybody having a kind of type or a phenotype
Style.
of how they navigate the transition that they respond. So my advice to people listening is, don't assume that the kind of advice that you want is, they said this to men for years, right? The men want to solve the problem and the women want to.
Right.
I don't believe that. And my wife and I are kind of ungendered.
I'm a huge problem solver. Yeah, I don't know.
But I do think it's an example of, don't assume that the path you would take through a transition, the type of advice you want, the kind of ritual that you would use, the kind of creativity that you would embrace is the same. Say to somebody that you want to be supportive, is there some creative enterprise, that you've always wanted to do? Not, why don't you bake? Because everyone's not going to want to bake.
Watercoloring. And also saying to someone, I think that your point about identifying the emotion, the strongest emotion you're feeling, is really helpful when people are in crisis like this. And right now, really, everyone is in some sort of crisis, right? So it's really, I think, a great book to kind of step back and both not feel alone, because you read a million stories. The book is full of fascinating stories about people. So it does make you feel like, yes, my cancer, my financial trouble, my this, my that is in a context, and other people have gone through these, but also really thinking about your own style and learning how you're going to get through it best. It's a very comforting book. It's kind of intellectually interesting and it's important, but I think it also gives people guidance, which is great.
Well, thank you very much for having
You're
me.
awesome, Bruce.
For sharing this story and for building this community. And I hope it starts a conversation among you.
Thank you. Love seeing you, and I wish you super good luck, and say hi to Linda and the girls and everything.
Thank you, everybody.